In the shadowed corridors of Tudor history, there exists a chapter so dark, so stained with blood and suffering, that it challenges everything we think we know about innocent childhood and divine right. When we imagine a 9-year-old boy ascending to the throne of England, we picture innocence, perhaps naivete, maybe even hope for a gentler reign. But what if that child had been raised in the most toxic environment imaginable, groomed from birth to believe in his own divine superiority, surrounded by ambitious men who saw his youth not as a liability, but as an opportunity? What if that boy's short reign unleashed a wave of terror that would leave thousands dead, countless more destitute, and an entire nation scarred by religious fanaticism? This is the true story of Edward VI, the boy king whose angelic face masked one of the darkest periods in English history. Edward Tudor was born on October 12, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace. His arrival into the world was celebrated with bonfires, celebrations, and 2,000 rounds of gunfire. For his father, Henry VIII, this moment represented the culmination of years of desperate longing, political upheaval, and unprecedented religious revolution. Henry had torn England away from the Catholic Church, dissolved his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, executed Anne Boleyn, and finally, with his third wife Jane Seymour, produced a legitimate male heir. But this triumph came at a terrible cost. Jane Seymour died 12 days after childbirth, leaving Edward motherless before he could even comprehend what a mother was. This would be the first tragedy in a life defined by loss, manipulation, and ultimately, profound cruelty. From his earliest moments, Edward was not raised as a child, but as a future king, a vessel for Protestant Reformation and a weapon against Catholic Europe. His education was relentless and unforgiving. By age 6, he could read and write in Latin, Greek, and French. He studied theology with a fervor that went beyond academic interest, becoming a zealous Protestant who viewed Catholicism not merely as wrong, but as an abomination worthy of extermination. His tutors, handpicked by his father and later by Protestant reformers, filled his young mind with ideas of divine kingship, absolute authority, and religious purity. They taught him that compromise was weakness, that mercy toward religious dissenters was a sin against God, and that his authority came directly from heaven itself. The boy had no friends his own age, no normal childhood experiences, and no one to show him compassion or teach him empathy. When Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, Edward was just 9 years old. The massive, terrifying figure who had dominated European politics for nearly 4 decades was gone, leaving his frail, religiously fanatical son to inherit a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. According to Henry's will, Edward would rule with the guidance of a regency council composed of 16 men. But power abhors a vacuum, and within days of Henry's death, Edward Seymour, the boy king's maternal uncle, executed a political coup. He declared himself Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively becoming the real power behind the throne. Somerset was an ambitious, ruthless man who saw Edward's reign as his opportunity to implement radical Protestant reforms that would reshape England forever. Edward himself, though young, was no passive puppet. Contemporary accounts describe him as cold, calculating, and surprisingly ruthless for his age. He kept detailed journals that reveal a mind obsessed with protocol, religion, and punishment. He wrote about executions with the detached interest of someone recording the weather. When his uncle Thomas Seymour, who had married Henry VIII's widow Catherine Parr, was arrested for treason and sentenced to death, Edward signed the death warrant without hesitation. Thomas Seymour had actually tried to befriend the young king, giving him pocket money and attention. But when accusations arose that Thomas had designs on the throne, Edward showed no mercy to the man who had shown him kindness. This coldness, this ability to condemn even those close to him, would characterize his entire reign. The stage was now set for one of the most brutal periods in English history. A sickly boy king, indoctrinated since birth with religious extremism, sat on the throne. Behind him stood ambitious regents who saw religious reform as a path to personal power and wealth. Before them lay a population largely still Catholic in sympathy, clinging to the old faith despite decades of reformation. The country had endured Henry VIII's break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, and the confiscation of church lands. But many hoped that with Henry's death there might be a return to stability, perhaps even a reconciliation with traditional religion. These hopes would be brutally crushed under Edward's reign. What made Edward's reign particularly horrifying was not just the violence, though there was plenty of that. It was the systematic nature of the cruelty, the way suffering was rationalized as godly work, and how a child who should have been learning compassion instead learned to inflict pain in the name of religious purity. His government would strip churches of their beauty, burn dissenters alive, crush popular uprisings with mass executions, and implement economic policies that caused widespread starvation. All of this was done in the name of a boy king who genuinely believed he was doing God's work. As we delve into the specific horrors of Edward VI's reign, remember that this was not ancient history occurring in some distant, unenlightened age. This happened in the 16th century, during the Renaissance, an age of learning, art, and supposed human advancement. The suffering inflicted during these 6 years would echo through English history for generations, leaving scars that would contribute to centuries of religious conflict. The boy king's reign would prove that youth is no guarantee of innocence, and that the most dangerous tyrants are often those who believe with absolute certainty that they are righteous. The first acts of Edward's government revealed the true nature of what was to come. Within months of his coronation, the Regency Council, with Edward's full approval, launched an aggressive campaign to transform England into a Protestant state. This was not to be a gradual transition or a matter of gentle persuasion. This would be reformation by force, implemented through a series of laws and decrees that would make religious dissent not just illegal, but punishable by death in the most agonizing ways imaginable. The first Book of Common Prayer was introduced in 1549, mandating Protestant services in English rather than Latin. This might sound like a mere translation issue, but for many English people, it represented the destruction of everything sacred. Churches across England were subjected to systematic destruction. The government issued orders that all religious imagery, statues, paintings, and decorations were to be removed and destroyed. These were not just ornaments. They were objects that communities had cherished for centuries, donated by their ancestors, and believed to be conduits of divine grace. Soldiers and commissioners descended on parishes with hammers and axes, smashing stained glass windows that had been crafted by master artisans generations before. They tore down rood screens, burned paintings of saints, and melted down precious metal crosses and chalices. The beautiful churches that had been the pride of English communities were stripped bare, their walls whitewashed, their grandeur erased. For many villagers who had known nothing but these sacred spaces, it felt like watching their mothers being violated. Priests who refused to conduct services in the new Protestant manner were arrested, imprisoned, and often executed. The old Catholic Mass, which had been celebrated in England for nearly 1,000 years, was now illegal. Anyone caught attending such a service could be imprisoned, fined, or worse. Informers were everywhere. Neighbors reported neighbors, and communities that had lived together peacefully for generations turned on each other. The fear was palpable. People no longer knew whom to trust. A careless word in the marketplace, a reference to the old ways, could mean arrest, torture, and death. The burnings began almost immediately. Under the heresy laws that remained in force, anyone who denied Protestant doctrine could be burned alive as a heretic. But now, in a cruel twist, Those who clung to Catholic beliefs were the ones branded as heretics. The first victims were often priests and monks who had been leaders in their communities. They were arrested on charges of heresy, given show trials where the verdict was predetermined, and sentenced to be burned at the stake. The executions were public spectacles designed to terrorize the population into compliance. Stakes were erected in town squares. Crowds were forced to attend. The condemned were chained to wooden posts with bundles of kindling and logs stacked around their feet. The process of burning alive was calculated to maximize suffering. The fires were deliberately set to burn slowly. The flames would first consume the feet and legs, causing excruciating pain, while the victim remained fully conscious. As the fire progressed upward, the heat would cause the skin to blister and peel away. The smoke would choke the lungs, making each breath agony. Death, when it finally came, could take half an hour or more. Some victims screamed until their vocal cords were destroyed. Others prayed or sang hymns, trying to maintain dignity in their final moments. The crowds watching these executions were expected to see them as justice being served, as examples of what happened to those who defied God's truth. But many walked away traumatized, having witnessed human beings transformed into burning torches in the name of religion. Among the most notable victims was Joan Bocher, known as Joan of Kent, a woman who held Anabaptist beliefs. She was arrested in 1548 and held in prison for a year while authorities tried to convince her to recant. She refused. Edward himself was reportedly troubled by the idea of burning a woman, not out of mercy, but because it seemed unseemly. Yet when his advisors insisted that heresy could not be tolerated, he signed her death warrant. On May 2nd, 1550, Joan Bocher was burned alive at Smithfield. Witnesses reported that she went to her death with courage, refusing to the end to renounce her beliefs. For Edward, this was divine justice. For many who witnessed it, it was the murder of a woman whose only crime was interpreting scripture differently than the state demanded. Another victim was George van Paris, a Dutch surgeon who denied the divinity of Christ. He was arrested in 1551 and, after a brief trial, sentenced to death. On April 25, 1551, he was burned alive at Smithfield. His crime was theological disagreement. His punishment was to be roasted alive in front of a crowd. These were not isolated incidents. Throughout Edward's reign, men and women were arrested, tortured, and executed for their religious beliefs. The exact number is difficult to determine because many executions went unrecorded, particularly in rural areas. But historians estimate that dozens were burned and hundreds more died in prison or from torture. Edward's role in these atrocities cannot be understated. While the Regency Council and later the Duke of Northumberland implemented the policies, Edward approved them enthusiastically. His personal writings reveal a boy who viewed religious dissenters not as human beings with different beliefs, but as cancers to be cut out of the body politic. He wrote about executions with satisfaction, noting them in his journal alongside entries about hunting and diplomatic meetings. There was no moral anguish, no questioning of whether burning people alive might be wrong. For Edward, raised from birth to believe in his absolute authority and the absolute truth of Protestant doctrine, these executions were not crimes, but holy acts. This made him, in many ways, more dangerous than a cynical adult using religion for political gain. Edward truly believed. In the summer of 1549, the people of Cornwall and Devon reached their breaking point. The imposition of the new prayer book, the destruction of their churches, and the suppression of their traditional religious practices had pushed them beyond endurance. These were not radicals or troublemakers. They were farmers, craftsmen, and ordinary people who simply wanted to worship as their ancestors had done. On Whit Monday, June 10th, 1549, the entire region rose in rebellion. This would become known as the Prayer Book Rebellion or the Western Rebellion, and its suppression would demonstrate the true brutality of Edward's government. The rebellion began when villagers in Sampford Courtenay forced their priest to conduct the old Catholic Mass instead of the new Protestant service. Word spread rapidly. Within days, thousands had joined the uprising. They were not calling for Edward's overthrow. Their demands were remarkably reasonable. They wanted the old Mass restored, the 6 articles of religion that Henry VIII had maintained reinstated, and the return of traditional holy days and ceremonies. They wanted their priests celibate as before, and they wanted the religious changes stopped. These were conservative people asking for tradition to be respected, not revolutionaries seeking to overthrow the social order. The government's response was swift and merciless. Somerset, the Lord Protector, was initially distracted by other matters and tried negotiation. But when the rebels refused to disperse, he dispatched Lord Russell with a military force to crush the uprising. Russell's army included foreign mercenaries, particularly Italian and German soldiers, who had no sympathy for English traditions. The rebels, armed with farm tools, hunting bows, and whatever weapons they could find, fortified Exeter and prepared to defend their cause. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Russell's forces surrounded Exeter and laid siege to the city. The rebels fought bravely, but they were no match for professional soldiers with artillery. When the city walls were breached, the soldiers poured in with orders to show no mercy. Men who surrendered were cut down where they stood. Women and children who tried to flee were trampled by cavalry. The streets ran with blood. Houses were burned. Anyone suspected of supporting the rebellion was executed on the spot. The siege lasted 6 weeks, and by the time it ended, thousands of rebels lay dead. But the killing did not end with the fall of Exeter. Russell's army pursued the fleeing rebels across Devon and Cornwall, hunting them like animals. Entire villages that had supported the uprising were punished. Men were hanged from trees as examples. Bodies were left to rot as warnings to others. The government wanted to ensure that no one would ever dare question religious policy again. In the town of Crediton, a priest named Father Robert Welsh had been a leader of the rebellion. When captured, he was subjected to a particularly cruel execution. He was hanged in his priestly robes from the tower of his own church, forced to die looking down at the community he had tried to defend. The death toll of the Western Rebellion is staggering. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 people died in the fighting and subsequent reprisals. This was in a region with a relatively small population. Entire communities lost their men. Fields went unharvested because the farmers were dead. Widows and orphans were left with nothing. The government showed no interest in reconciliation or mercy. Instead, they imposed massive fines on the surviving communities, bankrupting regions that were already devastated. The message was clear: resistance would be met with annihilation. Edward's reaction to the rebellion reveals much about his character. He was not troubled by the massive loss of life. In his journal, he wrote matter-of-factly about the suppression of the rebels, noting the casualties with the same tone he used to record the weather. There is no indication of regret, no acknowledgement that perhaps the government's religious policies had pushed people too far. Instead, Edward seems to have viewed the rebellion as proof that his subjects were sinful and stubborn, requiring even firmer guidance. The boy king learned nothing about mercy or compromise from the Western Rebellion. If anything, it hardened his resolve to impose religious conformity at any cost. The Western Rebellion was not an isolated incident. That same summer, another major uprising erupted in Norfolk. Ket's rebellion, as it became known, was primarily about economic grievances rather than religious ones. But the government's response was equally brutal. An army under the Earl of Warwick crushed the rebels at Dussindale, killing some 3,000 men in a single battle. The leaders were hanged, and once again, the countryside was subjected to reprisals and punishments. Edward's England was becoming a place where dissent of any kind, whether religious or economic, was met with overwhelming violence. The young king, rather than being sheltered from these realities, was made aware of them and approved of them. He was being trained not in kingship but in tyranny. While religious persecution dominated the headlines of Edward's reign, an equally devastating crisis was unfolding in the English countryside. This was the Great Enclosure movement, a process by which wealthy landowners seized common lands that had been used by entire communities for generations and converted them into private property. Under Edward's government, this process accelerated dramatically, driven by men who saw the young king's reign as an opportunity for personal enrichment. The consequences would be catastrophic for England's rural poor, leading to mass displacement, starvation, and death on a scale that rivaled the religious violence. For centuries, England's agricultural system had been based on common land. Villages had fields that were collectively managed, where every family had the right to farm strips of land, graze their animals, and gather firewood. This system was not perfect, but it provided a basic subsistence for even the poorest families. However, the rise of the wool trade made sheep farming immensely profitable. Landowners realized they could make far more money by converting cropland into sheep pastures. But sheep farming required far fewer workers than crop farming. The solution, from the landowner's perspective, was to enclose the common lands, evict the farmers, and turn entire villages into sheep runs. Under Edward's government, enclosure was not just permitted, but actively encouraged. Many of Edward's regents and councillors were themselves major landowners who profited from enclosure. They passed laws that made it easier to seize common lands and harder for communities to resist. When villagers protested, they were ignored or arrested. When they tried to tear down the fences and hedges that enclosed their traditional lands, they were punished as criminals. The government, which should have protected the rights of the common people, instead sided with the wealthy elite who were dispossessing them. The human cost of enclosure was staggering. Families who had farmed the same land for generations suddenly found themselves homeless. Entire villages were depopulated as residents were forced to leave and seek work elsewhere. But there was nowhere to go. The towns could not absorb the flood of displaced rural workers. Unemployment soared. Begging became epidemic. Contemporary observers described roads filled with vagrants, families with children wandering from place to place, sleeping in ditches, slowly starving to death. The government's response was not aid, but punishment. New laws classified unemployed people as vagrants and prescribed brutal penalties. First offense meant branding with a hot iron and 2 years of slavery. Repeat offenders could be hanged. The statistics tell a grim story. Historians estimate that during Edward's reign, between 1,000 and 2,000 villages were depopulated through enclosure. This represented tens of thousands of people driven from their homes. The poverty rate skyrocketed. Mortality rates, especially among children, increased dramatically. Harvest failures in 1549 and 1550 compounded the crisis. People who had lost their land had no way to feed themselves when food prices soared. Contemporary accounts describe children starving in the streets, the elderly dying of exposure, and desperate people eating grass and bark to survive. The government was not blind to this suffering. Reports reached London describing the desperate conditions in the countryside. Somerset himself seems to have been troubled by the enclosure crisis and made some half-hearted attempts at reform, but the wealthy landowners in the Regency Council blocked any meaningful action. They argued that enclosure was necessary for economic progress, that the wool trade enriched the nation, and that the displaced peasants simply needed to be more industrious. This was pure hypocrisy. The same men claiming economic necessity were the ones personally profiting from dispossessing the poor. Edward himself showed little interest in the plight of the poor. Raised in royal palaces, surrounded by luxury, and taught that he was divinely appointed to rule, he had no understanding of what starvation felt like or what it meant to be homeless. His journals make almost no mention of the enclosure crisis. When Kett's rebellion erupted, partly in protest against enclosure, Edward viewed it not as a legitimate grievance, but as treason to be crushed. The young king lived in a bubble of privilege so complete that the suffering of his subjects was literally invisible to him. The economic policies of Edward's reign had long-term consequences that extended far beyond his short life. The enclosure movement would continue for centuries, fundamentally transforming English agriculture and society. But the speed and brutality with which it was implemented during Edward's reign made the suffering particularly acute. Thousands died unnecessarily because the government prioritized the profits of the wealthy over the survival of the poor. This was not some inevitable consequence of economic change. It was a deliberate choice made by men who valued money over human life, enabled by a boy king who believed that the suffering of commoners was of no concern to someone appointed by God to rule. If there was one area where Edward's government operated with breathtaking efficiency, it was in the systematic looting of England's remaining religious institutions. Henry VIII had already dissolved the monasteries and seized their wealth, but substantial riches remained in parish churches, chantries, and guilds. Edward's government viewed these assets not as sacred objects serving religious purposes, but as untapped sources of revenue. What followed was one of the greatest acts of cultural and religious vandalism in English history, justified in the name of Protestant purity, but motivated primarily by greed. The Chantries Act of 1547 dissolved all chantries in England. Chantries were endowments established by wealthy individuals to pay priests to say masses for their souls after death. This practice was central to Catholic belief, but was declared superstitious by Protestants. The stated purpose of the act was religious reform. The actual purpose was to confiscate the substantial wealth these institutions controlled. The chantries owned land, buildings, and treasure. They also funded schools, hospitals, and poor relief. When the government seized these assets, it promised that the money would be used for education and charity. This was a lie. Commissioners were sent to every parish in England to inventory church property. They arrived with lists and orders to seize anything valuable. Gold and silver chalices were melted down. Jeweled vestments were confiscated. Ancient manuscripts were torn apart for their bindings. Bells were removed from towers and sold as scrap metal. Even the brass from tombs was pried up and carted away. The commissioners were systematic and thorough. Nothing was too sacred, too historic, or too beloved by the community to escape seizure. Churches that had been the glory of their villages for centuries were stripped to bare walls. The scale of this plunder was immense. Records show that the government seized thousands of chalices, hundreds of sets of vestments, tons of precious metal, and countless works of art. Much of this treasure had been accumulated over centuries, donated by generations of faithful parishioners. To see it carted away by government officials was devastating for communities. It was not just the loss of material wealth. These objects had spiritual and emotional significance. They connected people to their ancestors, their faith, and their sense of community. Their removal left churches feeling dead and empty. Where did all this wealth go? Very little went to the education and charity promised in the Chantries Act. Instead, it enriched the king's councillors and their allies. Men who already had vast estates acquired more property. The king's favourites received gifts of confiscated treasure. Some treasures were sold abroad, enriching foreign merchants while impoverishing English parishes. The Protestant Reformation, whatever its genuine religious motivations among true believers, became at the highest levels a cover for massive corruption and theft. The men ruling in Edward's name were robbing the nation blind. The loss extended beyond material wealth. When the chantries were dissolved, the schools they supported closed. Hospitals lost their funding. Poor relief disappeared. In many communities, these institutions had been the only source of education and care for the destitute. Their closure meant that children went uneducated, the sick went untreated, and the poor went unfed. The government's promises to maintain these services were empty words. Edward's reign saw a massive contraction in social welfare at precisely the moment when economic dislocation was creating unprecedented need. Religious guilds, which had been centers of community life, were also dissolved. These organizations had provided mutual aid, organized festivals, maintained churches, and supported members in times of need. Their dissolution fragmented communities that had been bound together for generations. The social fabric of English life, already strained by religious changes and economic upheaval, began to tear apart. People felt unmoored, their traditional sources of support and identity stripped away in the name of religious reform that few had requested and many actively opposed. Edward's personal involvement in this plunder is difficult to assess. He was young, and the actual organization of the seizures was handled by his regents. However, Edward benefited from the wealth extracted from churches. He wore jewels taken from religious shrines. He lived in palaces furnished with confiscated art. He made grants of church lands to his favorites. Whether he understood the human cost of these actions is doubtful. Whether he cared is even more doubtful. Edward had been taught that Protestant purity required the destruction of Catholic superstition. If removing golden chalices helped achieve that goal while also enriching the crown, he would have seen it as a double victory. The cultural loss inflicted during Edward's reign is incalculable. Thousands of medieval works of art were destroyed. Manuscripts containing centuries of accumulated knowledge were burned or lost. Churches that had taken generations to beautify were stripped in days. The aesthetic and spiritual heritage of England was systematically dismantled. While some justified this as necessary religious reform, the reality is that much was destroyed not for faith, but for profit. England would never recover from this loss. The rich, artistic and religious culture that had developed over nearly 1,000 years was gone forever, replaced by bare churches and a profound sense of cultural impoverishment. Behind the religious persecution, economic devastation, and cultural plunder of Edward's reign lay a vicious power struggle among the men competing to control the young king. These were not principled leaders seeking the best for England. They were ambitious nobles who viewed Edward as a tool to be manipulated for personal gain. The political intrigues and resulting executions during Edward's reign were marked by a ruthlessness that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to Tudor brutality. Edward himself, rather than being an innocent victim of these machinations, actively participated in the destruction of anyone deemed a threat to his power. The first major casualty was Thomas Seymour, Edward's uncle and brother to the Lord Protector Somerset. Thomas was charismatic, ambitious, and dangerously reckless. After Henry VIII's death, he married the king's widow, Catherine Parr, without seeking permission. This alone was a serious breach of protocol, but Thomas went further. He began cultivating a relationship with the young king, giving him money, visiting him privately, and allegedly discussing plans for Edward to assert his authority against his brother. Thomas also behaved inappropriately toward the young Princess Elizabeth, who lived in his household. His actions became increasingly erratic and threatening to the established order. In January 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested on charges of treason. The evidence against him was substantial. He had attempted to break into the king's bedchamber, had plotted to marry Princess Elizabeth to gain a claim to the throne, and had raised a private army. Somerset, despite being Thomas's brother, did not intervene to save him. The Regency Council wanted him dead, viewing him as a destabilizing force, but they needed Edward's signature on a bill of attainder to execute him legally. Edward, who was then 11 years old, signed without hesitation. He showed no emotional attachment to the uncle who had been kind to him, no moral qualms about sending a family member to his death. On March 20th, 1549, Thomas Seymour was beheaded on Tower Hill. Edward recorded the execution in his journal as a simple matter of fact. But Somerset's own position was precarious. His failure to control the uprisings of 1549 and his apparent sympathy for some of the rebels' economic grievances made him vulnerable. His rival, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, saw an opportunity. In October 1549, Dudley launched a coup, arresting Somerset and taking control of the government. Somerset was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Initially, he was released and allowed to return to court, but the reconciliation was superficial. Dudley, who would soon become Duke of Northumberland, began systematically building a case against Somerset, accusing him of plotting to overthrow the government and murder council members. In December 1551, Somerset was arrested again on charges of treason and felony. His trial was a farce. The evidence was weak and contradictory, but the verdict was predetermined. Somerset was found guilty of felony, though acquitted of treason. It made no difference. Northumberland wanted him dead, and he convinced Edward that Somerset represented a continuing threat. On January 22, 1552, Somerset was executed on Tower Hill before a crowd of thousands. Witnesses reported that he faced death with dignity, maintaining his innocence to the end. For Edward, this was another simple entry in his journal. His own uncle, who had served as his guardian and protector, was dead at his command. The boy king showed neither remorse nor regret. Northumberland now held unchallenged power. He was even more ruthless and avaricious than Somerset had been. He systematically enriched himself and his allies, extracting wealth from the crown, seizing more church property, and awarding himself vast estates. He also strengthened his position by marrying his son, Guildford Dudley, to Lady Jane Grey, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII. This marriage would prove crucial to Northumberland's ultimate ambitions. By 1553, it was clear that Edward was dying. Northumberland realized that if Mary, Edward's Catholic half-sister, inherited the throne, he would almost certainly be executed for his role in the religious persecution. He needed to change the succession. Remarkably, Edward cooperated enthusiastically with this plan. Despite Henry VIII's will clearly establishing the succession, despite the laws of the realm, Edward and Northumberland drafted a new succession document. This device for the succession, as it became known, excluded both Mary and Elizabeth from the throne on dubious grounds. Instead, it named Lady Jane Grey as Edward's heir. Edward personally revised this document, making changes in his own handwriting to ensure it said exactly what he wanted. His motivation was religious. He could not bear the thought of Catholic Mary undoing his Protestant reforms. He was willing to disinherit his own sisters and overturn his father's will to prevent it. The political machinations of Edward's reign resulted in executions beyond the Seymour brothers. Numerous lesser figures were arrested, tried, and executed on charges of treason, heresy, or felony. The aristocratic victims at least died by beheading, a relatively quick death, but many others died by hanging, a slower and more agonizing process. Some were hanged, drawn, and quartered, the standard punishment for treason. This meant being hanged until nearly dead, then cut down alive, disemboweled while conscious, and finally beheaded and quartered. The brutality of Tudor justice reached new heights under Edward's reign, and the young king approved of it all. What makes Edward's role in these political executions particularly chilling is his emotional detachment. Other Tudor monarchs, including his father, often showed at least some pretense of regret when executing former allies or family members. Edward showed none. His journals describe executions with the same flat, matter-of-fact tone he used for everything else. There is no indication of internal struggle, no sign that he understood he was ordering the deaths of human beings. He had been so thoroughly indoctrinated, so completely isolated from normal human relationships, that he seems to have lost the capacity for empathy entirely. He was a boy king who could sign death warrants as easily as he could approve a new tapestry for his chambers. While the high politics of Edward's reign played out in palaces and council chambers, the common people of England experienced its consequences in their daily lives. For most English men and women, the reign of Edward VI meant increased hardship, fear, and uncertainty. The religious changes, economic policies, and social upheaval created a population living in constant anxiety about survival. To understand the full horror of Edward's reign, we must look beyond the spectacular executions and political intrigues to the grinding, everyday suffering of ordinary people trying to live through one of the darkest periods in English history. The destruction of traditional religious life had profound psychological effects on communities. For people raised in the Catholic faith, the Mass was not just a ritual, but the central organizing principle of existence. It marked births, marriages, and deaths. It structured the calendar year with feast days and holy days. It provided meaning, comfort, and hope. When the Mass was banned, when churches were stripped of their beauty, when familiar rituals were replaced with alien Protestant services, people felt spiritually adrift. Contemporary accounts describe a population in mourning, grieving for the loss of their faith as they might grieve for a dead parent. The fear of informers poisoned social relationships. People could no longer speak freely, even in their own homes. A careless comment about the old religion, an expression of doubt about Protestant doctrine, even a nostalgic memory of pre-Reformation times could be reported to authorities. Neighbors turned against neighbors, hoping for rewards or favor. Children were encouraged to report their parents. The atmosphere of mutual suspicion corroded communities. Trust, once destroyed, is difficult to rebuild. The social damage inflicted during these years would persist long after Edward's death. Economic hardship reached desperate levels for many families. The combination of enclosure, poor harvests, and inflation created a crisis of subsistence. Food prices soared while wages stagnated. People who had previously managed to feed their families found themselves choosing which children would eat. Malnutrition became epidemic. Disease, which always struck hardest at the malnourished, swept through communities. Mortality rates increased, particularly among the young and old. The most vulnerable members of society suffered most, and the government offered no relief. The collapse of traditional social welfare made survival even harder. Before the Reformation, monasteries, chantries, and guilds had provided a safety net for the destitute. They distributed food to the hungry, cared for the sick, and provided shelter for travelers. When these institutions were dissolved, nothing replaced them. The government's poor laws were harsh and inadequate. They criminalized poverty rather than addressing it. People who lost their homes and livelihoods through no fault of their own were branded as vagrants and punished. The message from Edward's government was clear. If you could not support yourself, you deserved to suffer. Children bore a disproportionate burden of Edward's reign. Thousands were orphaned by the rebellions and their brutal suppression. Thousands more were displaced by enclosure. Child mortality soared due to malnutrition and disease. Educational opportunities contracted as chantry schools closed. For children born into poverty during Edward's reign, life was likely to be short, hungry, and brutal. The king himself was a child, but he seemed to have no special concern for the welfare of the youngest and most vulnerable of his subjects. In his privileged bubble, surrounded by luxury, he was insulated from any awareness of their suffering. Women faced particular hardships during this period. The dissolution of convents had eliminated one of the few institutions where women could exercise authority and live independently. The Protestant emphasis on marriage and motherhood as women's proper roles narrowed the options available to them. Widows, who had already been vulnerable, found their situations worsening as traditional support systems collapsed. Women accused of witchcraft, always a convenient scapegoat during times of social stress, faced increased persecution. The misogyny inherent in Tudor society was amplified by the chaos and fear of Edward's reign. The psychological toll of living through Edward's reign cannot be quantified, but should not be underestimated. People experienced a profound sense of loss. The world they had known was being destroyed before their eyes. Old certainties were gone. The future seemed dark and threatening. Depression, despair, and hopelessness must have been widespread. Some turned to alcohol for comfort. Others retreated into themselves, trying to endure until better times came. Many simply lost hope entirely. The trauma inflicted on an entire generation would have lasting effects on English society. Yet amid all this suffering, people found ways to resist and survive. Some secretly maintained Catholic practices, hiding forbidden objects and conducting clandestine services. Communities developed systems of mutual aid to replace lost institutions. People helped each other in small ways, sharing food, offering shelter, providing emotional support. The resilience of ordinary people in the face of governmental oppression and economic disaster is one of the few bright spots in this dark period. They endured because they had no choice, and they helped each other endure because it was the only way to maintain their humanity in an increasingly inhumane world. To understand how Edward's reign could be so cruel, we must examine the boy king himself. What kind of person was Edward VI? What did he believe? How did he spend his days? The answers to these questions reveal a deeply disturbing portrait of a child molded into a fanatic, isolated from normal human relationships and convinced of his own divine righteousness. Edward was not a monster in the conventional sense. He was worse, a true believer who thought the terrible things done in his name were good and necessary. Edward was physically frail. He had inherited his mother's delicate constitution. From early childhood, he suffered from various ailments. He caught colds easily and recovered slowly. His health would ultimately kill him at just 15 years old. But mental and religious conviction compensated for physical weakness. Edward approached his studies with ferocious intensity. He woke early, spent hours in religious devotions, then moved to lessons in languages, history, theology, and statecraft. He was brilliant, absorbing information rapidly and demonstrating a precocious intelligence that impressed his tutors. But this intelligence was entirely directed toward religious orthodoxy and political absolutism. Edward's religious beliefs were extreme even by the standards of Protestant reformers. He did not simply prefer Protestant theology. He viewed Catholicism as evil incarnate. He referred to the Mass as idolatry and to the Pope as the Antichrist. His writings reveal a mind consumed with religious purity, viewing every political and social issue through the lens of Protestant doctrine. He had no tolerance for ambiguity or compromise. Things were either godly or satanic. People were either the elect or the damned. This rigid worldview, combined with absolute political power, created a recipe for tyranny. Edward's personal relationships were stunted and peculiar. He had no close friends his own age. His companions were chosen for him, carefully selected to ensure they would not challenge his authority or corrupt his Protestant education. His relationship with his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, was formal and distant. Mary, being Catholic, was particularly problematic for Edward. He pressured her repeatedly to abandon her faith, growing increasingly frustrated when she refused. He once told her that he would rather she died than continued in her idolatry. This was not adolescent hyperbole. Edward meant it. His religious convictions overwhelmed any fraternal affection. Edward's journals provide the most revealing window into his character. He kept detailed accounts of his reign, recording events with meticulous attention to protocol and precedent. But these journals are strikingly cold. Human suffering rarely merits mention. He records executions, battles, and diplomatic negotiations with the same flat tone. When he writes about the suppression of the Prayer Book Rebellion, he notes the casualty figures but shows no empathy for the dead or concern for the reasons behind the uprising. When he signs death warrants for men who had been his relatives or servants, he treats it as routine administrative business. Yet Edward was not entirely without feeling. He showed affection for certain individuals, particularly Barnaby Fitzpatrick, an Irish boy who served as his whipping boy. In Tudor times, it was considered inappropriate to physically punish a prince, so a whipping boy would be punished in his place. Edward seems to have developed genuine fondness for Barnaby, writing him letters when they were separated. But even this relationship reveals Edward's limitations. He could care about individuals within his immediate circle, but remained completely indifferent to the suffering of the masses. His capacity for empathy did not extend beyond the palace walls. Edward's daily life was rigid and ceremonial. Every moment was structured. He rose early, attended prayers, studied, received petitions, held council meetings, studied more, attended more prayers, and retired early. Recreation consisted of hunting, which he enjoyed, and watching tournaments. He had little opportunity for spontaneity or joy. He was a child living the life of a bureaucrat, processing the business of the kingdom with grim efficiency. This regimented existence reinforced his already severe personality, giving him no chance to develop warmth, humor, or flexibility. The people around Edward bear responsibility for creating this monster. His tutors filled his head with extreme theology. His regents used him as a figurehead for policies motivated by greed and ambition. No one taught him mercy or compassion. No one showed him that authority could be exercised with kindness rather than terror. He was systematically denied the experiences that might have humanized him. He never knew genuine friendship, romantic love, or the satisfaction of creating rather than destroying. By the time he was old enough to rule independently, his personality was fixed. He was a zealot who genuinely believed that burning heretics and crushing dissenters was godly work. What makes Edward's character most disturbing is its recognizability. He was not some alien consciousness incomprehensible to modern minds. He was a boy who'd been taught wrong from right, who believed sincerely in his cause, who saw himself as righteous. This makes him more dangerous than a cynical tyrant who knows he is doing evil. Edward never doubted. He never questioned whether perhaps his policies were causing unnecessary suffering. He never wondered if maybe God did not actually want him to burn people alive. His certainty, combined with his power, made him one of the most destructive rulers in English history, despite his youth and short reign. By 1552, Edward's health had begun to deteriorate noticeably. He had always been delicate, but now his illnesses became more frequent and severe. He developed a persistent cough. He lost weight. His complexion became pale and waxy. Physicians were concerned, but Edward himself seemed determined to maintain his schedule of work and study. He had ambitious plans for further religious reform, for dealing with his sister Mary's recalcitrance, and for ensuring that Protestant England would outlive him. But tuberculosis, that great killer of the era, had marked him for death. As Edward's condition worsened in early 1553, panic set in among the Protestant faction. Northumberland realized that when Edward died, Mary would claim the throne. She would undo all the religious changes, and those responsible for the Protestant Reformation would face execution. Northumberland had Edward's ear and began the process of disinheriting Mary. He argued that Mary's Catholicism made her unfit to rule, that allowing her to succeed would betray everything Edward had worked for. Edward, who already viewed his sister with religious contempt, needed little convincing. He began drafting his device for the succession. The device for the succession was legally dubious and morally questionable. It directly contradicted Henry VIII's will and the Act of Succession passed by Parliament. But Edward did not care about legalities. He cared about religion. He personally revised the document multiple times, his handwriting becoming increasingly shaky as his health declined. He was determined that Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, would succeed him. That Jane happened to be married to Northumberland's son was convenient but secondary. For Edward, this was about preserving the Protestant Reformation, even if it meant overthrowing the established succession and potentially causing civil war. By May 1553, Edward was clearly dying. He could no longer leave his bed. His cough produced blood and foul-smelling sputum. His body was covered in sores. He experienced excruciating pain. Renaissance medicine could do nothing for him. The physicians tried various treatments, all useless and some actively harmful. Edward endured his suffering with the same grim determination he had shown throughout his life. He knew he was dying, and he was racing against time to secure his succession plans. He pressured judges and councillors to sign the device, using his remaining strength to ensure his will would be enacted. In his final weeks, Edward's suffering was intense. Tuberculosis is a terrible death. The lungs fill with fluid, making every breath agony. Fever alternates with chills. The body wastes away. Edward experienced all of this while maintaining his religious devotions and trying to manage affairs of state. Some accounts suggest he experienced moments of doubt near the end, perhaps wondering if his suffering was divine punishment. But his Protestant chaplains reassured him that he was dying a martyr for the true faith, that his suffering had meaning, that he would be rewarded in heaven. Edward seems to have found comfort in this. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old. His last words were reportedly a prayer asking God to defend the realm and protect the Protestant faith. His death was kept secret for 2 days, while Northumberland tried to consolidate power and prepare to proclaim Jane Grey as Queen. When Edward's death was finally announced, many English people felt relief. The boy king who had presided over so much suffering was gone. Perhaps people hoped things would improve. Edward was buried with full royal honors in Westminster Abbey. The funeral was conducted according to Protestant rites, which he would have wanted. Ironically, within months, his sister Mary would be crowned queen and England would return to Catholicism. All of Edward's desperate efforts to prevent this outcome had failed. The succession device was ignored. Jane Grey's reign lasted 9 days before Mary claimed the throne. Northumberland was executed. The Protestant reforms Edward had fought so hard to impose were rolled back. In this sense, Edward's reign was a failure even on its own terms. But the damage Edward's reign had inflicted could not be so easily undone. Thousands were dead. Communities were shattered. Churches were despoiled. The social fabric was torn. Religious divisions had been intensified. The trauma and suspicion of Edward's reign would poison English society for generations. Mary's subsequent persecution of Protestants would mirror Edward's persecution of Catholics, creating a cycle of religious violence that would continue through Elizabeth's reign and beyond. Edward had planted seeds of hatred that would bear bitter fruit long after his death. Looking back on Edward's death, one cannot help but feel it was premature in an ironic way. Had he lived longer, had he reached true adulthood, would he have moderated his views? Might experience have taught him mercy? We will never know. He died before he could learn from his mistakes, if indeed he ever would have. He died still believing he had done right, that his reign had been godly, that his victims had deserved their fates. This certainty, this inability to doubt, this conviction of absolute rightness makes his story all the more tragic and disturbing. The legacy of Edward VI's reign extends far beyond the 6 years he sat on England's throne. In the immediate aftermath of his death, as Mary Tudor worked to restore Catholicism, there was a strong temptation to view Edward's reign as an aberration, a brief nightmare from which England had awakened. But history is never so simple. The policies implemented during Edward's reign, the hatreds inflamed, the precedents set, and the suffering inflicted would shape English history for centuries. To understand the religious conflicts that would define Tudor and Stuart England, we must grapple with what happened during those 6 dark years. Edward's reign established a pattern of religious persecution that would be repeated by his successors. Mary would burn Protestant martyrs just as Edward's government had burned Catholics. Elizabeth would execute Catholic priests just as Edward had persecuted Catholic clergy. The cycle of violence once started proved almost impossible to stop. Each round of persecution created martyrs, and martyrs inspired further resistance, which provoked further persecution. The religious toleration that would eventually emerge in England came not from any Tudor conviction, but from sheer exhaustion after generations of killing in God's name. The economic and social changes accelerated during Edward's reign proved irreversible. The dissolution of chantries and guilds, the acceleration of enclosure, and the creation of a landless rural proletariat transformed English society. The medieval world of corporate identities, communal agriculture, and ubiquitous religious institutions was gone forever. The modern world of private property, wage labor, and limited social welfare had begun to emerge. These changes would have happened eventually, but the speed and brutality with which they were implemented during Edward's reign intensified the suffering and social dislocation. The cultural vandalism of Edward's reign represents one of the greatest losses in English history. Countless works of medieval art, literature, and architecture were destroyed. The rich visual and musical culture of pre-Reformation England was systematically dismantled. What survived did so by accident, or because individuals risked punishment to hide precious objects. Modern England is culturally poorer because of what was lost during Edward's reign. The bare Protestant churches, while they have their own austere beauty, cannot replace the rich artistic heritage that was demolished in the name of religious purity. Historians have struggled to assess Edward's personal responsibility for the horrors of his reign. Some argue that he was merely a child, manipulated by ambitious adults who used him as a figurehead for their own purposes. There is truth to this. Somerset and Northumberland were the real powers behind the throne, and they bore primary responsibility for policy. But this explanation is too simple. Edward was not a passive observer. He approved policies enthusiastically. He signed death warrants willingly. He pushed for even more radical reforms than his regents sometimes wanted. He was a true believer. And true believers are often more dangerous than cynical opportunists. The question of whether Edward was evil or merely misguided is probably unanswerable. He was a product of his upbringing, indoctrinated from birth with beliefs that dehumanized those who disagreed with him. He never had the opportunity to develop normal human empathy. He was isolated, manipulated, and used by adults who should have protected him. In another sense, these explanations feel like excuses. Many children are raised in difficult circumstances and do not grow up to preside over mass killings. Many people hold firm religious beliefs without burning those who disagree. At some point, regardless of circumstances, individuals must be held accountable for their choices, even if those individuals are children. The victims of Edward's reign deserve to be remembered. The men and women burned alive for their beliefs. The rebels who died defending their traditional faith and way of life. The children who starved due to economic dislocation. The communities destroyed by enclosure. The artists and craftsmen whose work was demolished. The priests and monks who were persecuted for maintaining their vows. These people were not abstractions or statistics. They were human beings with names, families, hopes, and dreams. They suffered terribly, and their suffering had meaning even if it accomplished nothing politically. In our own time, Edward VI's reign offers disturbing lessons. It demonstrates how ideology, when combined with absolute conviction of righteousness, can justify any cruelty. It shows how systems of oppression operate through ordinary people doing their jobs, following orders, and believing they are serving a higher purpose. It reminds us that youth is no guarantee of innocence, that children raised in hatred will often perpetuate it, and that the most dangerous fanatics are those who genuinely believe they are doing good. These lessons remain relevant in an age still plagued by religious extremism, ideological certitude, and the abuse of power. Edward VI's reign lasted only 6 years, but those years were dense with suffering, violence, and loss. His brief life was a tragedy on multiple levels. It was a tragedy that a child was warped into a fanatic. It was a tragedy that religious conviction was used to justify cruelty. It was a tragedy that so many people died, were displaced, or saw their worlds destroyed. It was a tragedy that the opportunity for peaceful religious reform was lost in a tide of extremism. And it was a tragedy that the lessons of his reign were not learned, that the patterns established during those years would be repeated by his successors. As we close this examination of Edward VI's horrifying reign, we are left with uncomfortable questions. How should we remember him? As a victim of manipulation, or as a perpetrator of atrocities? As a child who cannot be blamed for his upbringing, or as a ruler responsible for his decisions? As a sincere religious reformer, or as a fanatic who caused needless suffering? Perhaps the answer is that he was all of these things simultaneously. History rarely offers us simple villains or heroes. Edward VI was a complex figure whose life and reign illuminate some of the darkest aspects of human nature: religious extremism and the abuse of power. His story disturbs us because it reminds us of what human beings, even young ones, are capable of when they believe absolutely in their own righteousness. That is a lesson we forget at our peril.